My first experience with diving into the world of fantasy came when I read The Hobbit. I was probably 9 years old. It was so deeply pivotal and transitional for me. I found myself wandering around in the Shire all day long, even when I was in my backyard. I thought I wanted to be back in that space. And that's when Dungeons and Dragons came along for me. And I felt like, oh my God, here is the portal to get back to that space. And I've been trying to ever since. And I believe, and we do. That's why we do these things. Now, immersion and theater of the mind and getting into that space requires certain things. And today we're going to be talking about 3 primary areas from which we use our imagination in the world of tabletop role-playing games. And I think all of them have pros and cons, but we're going to chat a little bit about that today and hopefully get to the bottom of certain things. Stay tuned. Hey everybody, welcome to iCast Guidance, your Dungeons & Dragons podcast, where every week Garret and I take a ruler mechanic in the game of D&D that's lackluster or needs improvement, and we offer you advice on how to make your game around that rule more interesting or more fun. So sharpen up those daggers. We're getting started right now.
And welcome to the podcast this week, guys. Richard Frohman here. This week with me, I have 2 special guests, Todd Lambrix and Garret Brennan. Guys, how we doing today?
Dude,
we're doing great.
I'm the one who starts off. I think you fucking fired me because you realize. So, all right. So you guys should know this. I've been fired by Rich and Garret because we just did 40 minutes of collective podcasting to get today's episode ready for you. And Garrett's mic wasn't hot. So I think I'm being forcibly removed from the chair.
I mean, you don't want my opinions in it anyway. I understand.
The producers called me. I'm going to have 2 new people with me next week. It's a hostile takeover.
What's going on, people? We are here and probably a little too giddy because we're trying to be positive about the fact that we just screwed up this podcast. But we've got a great topic to talk about today now that we are finally working this out. Live and learn, right? Live and learn. It's cool. How you guys doing?
Honestly, feeling pretty great. I got a nice little mocha latte in me. I am rolling off the antibiotics, and we are chilling and excited for this podcast episode.
Garret?
The weather's changing. It's becoming a little cooler out. This is the time of year that I like it.
Oh, I do too.
I love it. I woke up this morning crisp, cool. Yeah, it's kind of like, a little muggy out, a little weird, but it's hitting right.
Yeah, totally. And I feel the same way. But of course, then I'm sitting here like loving on the weather and I'm thinking about all those people in Tennessee and North Carolina that got absolutely obliterated with this hurricane. And I feel awful. I was watching some of that footage in horror. I couldn't believe how violent that was.
Yeah. Some crazy stuff coming out of there.
All right, so we got a great podcast for you today, but we usually start off by reading a listener comment that was left, and we've got a good one that comes from Bravado, of occasional, I should say a regular commenter in our podcast, which I'm really thankful for, but this one's good. It says, okay, I'm 26 seconds into the video, but I have to ask, as it is slightly related to roleplay. What's your reaction to this? When a player comes to your table and brings in a 4-page document detailing their entire character life up until this point, the family tree, sparing no detail on past trauma for great achievements, with the expectation of, this will fit in the dungeon and it's, I can't wait for it to happen, basically. So this comment, and it goes on, it says, I only asked because this happened to me a few days ago in prepping a new table. My obvious concern is, okay, here's the main character, but my optimistic side says this person just likes to create and write. We've hit this before. We've had this happen in our table before. And as a GM, it puts a lot of pressure on me to sort of say, oh my God, I've got this massive book of information on this character that I now have to sort of find ways to weave in. But what are your thoughts?
Massive green flag. I will take this character over someone who doesn't write a backstory any day of the week. It only, it could be if you read into it and, you really want to like check it out, it could be a red flag. Like maybe they have main character syndrome, but the only thing it confirms off the bat is that they are invested.
I have to agree. And I love the words main character syndrome. Never heard that before, but that's really applicable to a lot of people I've played with. Garret, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think this person is definitely creative, and they're probably going to bring a lot to the table. If they're coming to a session 0 or a pregame with that much information on a backstory, I mean, they're invested. You said it. I mean, coming from my standpoint, that's not what I do, but I usually build my character along. I come with less, but I give props to this person. But Rich might have put it. I mean, maybe they want focus more on them.
Yeah. Well,
hard to say.
I think this is a real moment to talk about setting expectations with your players, right? So as a GM, I'm going to take that person aside and I'm going to say, look, I really love what you're doing here and I really appreciate your commitment to the game. Can we both agree on a couple of things? One, can we be flexible in how this backstory unfolds? And two, can we agree that we're not going to get to it all at once, that this is a better thing that maybe we parse out into multiple chapters or different story arcs so that we don't have to swallow this whole thing at one time?
Agreed. I mean, I could speak from personal experience. I created a homebrew world and a homebrew campaign, and one of my characters wanted to be from a city that I personally didn't flesh out yet. So I let him create that city and flesh it out. And in doing so, he inspired me so much that like it created a whole narrative that I wasn't even prepared for. Some Godfather, cookie baker, political crazy narrative in my city that I was not ready for, and it was awesome.
Well, and I love that because this is a standpoint that I talk from all the time about how, this shouldn't be writing a story as a GM. You should be creating a framework. Let your players design and narrate the cities they're from. That helps to sort of build the whole story out in a way you wouldn't have expected. 5 authors at a table writing a story, in my opinion, is better than 1. So, you have less agency and less control, and that's kind of by design and a good thing for a GM and a healthy table, in my opinion. So I love this comment, and I think, bravado, I would say that, set expectations. That's the key thing right there. All right, so we've got a great podcast today. We've got a really interesting topic that I'm excited to talk about. It is something I got to tell you, I got a hot take in here at some point. I'm not going to lie. But the topic today has to do with theater of the mind versus the use of miniatures and terrain versus the virtual tabletop world. These are basically the 3 spaces from which our imaginations play this game. And sometimes, if not all the time, they are conflicted to some degree or another. And I'm curious about how, you guys work this out in your minds, but I wanted to kick it off talking about theater of the mind.
Tell me I'm biased. Tell me, I'm just a lame actor coming from a lame actor's perspective, but Theater of the Mind is my personal favorite. I think it respects the GM, it respects the players, and it puts enough weight on our shoulders to fill in the gaps of this story as beautifully as our minds could, because as we all know, sometimes our imagination is more powerful than anything else.
I will say you're biased, but I'm certainly going to agree with you in that I think Theater of the Mind is my personal favorite as well. I feel like this is the space where the imagination truly can, do its thing and be rewarding. But I often find that the more things we introduce from the physical game itself, the more we tend to be distracted. So what is a game like Daggerheart from Critical Role and Darrington Press? What do they do to kind of help move the fiction and the story along? They streamline those mechanics to give us more space to delve into the fiction and the story, to allow our heads to immerse themselves in that story, right? Mm-hmm. Garret, what are your thoughts on this?
You're a lame actor, and I want to play with little miniatures, and I want to move them around the map, and we'll have fun with them. Anyway,
did you just say pew pew?
Yeah, I did. A little pew pew. That was the fire bolt,
right?
Pew.
Yes,
or the magic missile.
Magic missiles are perfect pew pew.
There we go. Sorry, no, that was my little hot take, but no, bringing it back. I think Theater of the Mind can be really an immersive experience that as long as you've got a good DM, GM that can describe the scenario and the location and everything, I think it might be one of the best options. It's going to get you, in there, immersed, and, just in your mind, creating a space and a vision.
Yeah, that's dead on. I feel like description is the top level element of theater of the mind, and we have to we have to agree, number one, that not only is the GM going to be responsible for that description, but the players are also going to participate as well. That this has to be an exchange, right? That's on all of us. I can't tell you enough how frustrated I get when I'm scrolling through TikTok, and of course my algorithm just pushes a ton of Dungeons & Dragons TTRPG stuff at me, especially around the worlds of GMing and DMing. And you see content creators on TikTok talking about a scene that unfolds. And, they kind of do the what's it called? Shot, reverse shot, but with themselves. And so it's sort of like one's the GM and one's the player. Sometimes they'll even dress differently, but they'll be like, okay, you guys walk into a tavern. Then the player says, I want to order a beer. And the GM says, you order a beer. And then the player says, great, I take the beer over to the table. And the GM says, what do you want to do? It is the driest, blandest, most awful exchange. And I'm thinking to myself, this is so anti-theater of the mind. It's so mechanical and robot-like. Yeah. It's terrible.
At that point, you might as well be doing a VTT. You could just you could show us without telling us. You know what I mean?
Well, there's a great thing to say, right?
Yeah.
Because we often, especially in the world of creativity and art, it's like show, don't tell. Mm-hmm. But in this space, it's kind of tell, right? It's more about, okay, so I was thinking this, when you have a writer and a writer has to describe a scene in a book, all right, there's an economy that exists in that descriptive world that is limited. You only have your reader for a certain amount of time. So my wife, who's a writer, I said to her the other day, I was like, so we're prepping for this podcast and I'm thinking about this, the way we write versus the way we talk. I said, so let me ask you a question. You're about to write a book and you're going to describe the time of year it is now. What do you call it? And she said, autumn. I said, right. But now you're at work with your friends and you're talking about the crispness in the air. What do you call it? And she's like, fall. There's a formality to writing that kind of requires the use of the word autumn. And it also requires a description about the crispness of the air, the color of the light, the feel of the space that says, I've got you for a short time and I got to pack this in. Whereas discussion, it's like, yeah, I woke up this morning and, I had the pollen in my nose and the air was crisp and it was nice. It was hard getting out from under the covers. It really feels like fall. And someone's like, now we're having a dialogue where we've got the room and the flexibility to fill in holes and gaps wherever we need to, because we don't have to have an investment in the other person's experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. I also think that a big, differentiating factor between that kind of robotic storytelling that you were talking about and this kind of poetic writer form of storytelling is just touching on the senses. What are you seeing? What are you smelling? What are you feeling?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And this is not a comfortable space for a lot of people to be. Mm-hmm. Right. So, I'm not saying that while we sit here and say theater of the mind is the best, it's not the best for everyone. This is going to be a really difficult space for a lot of people to get involved in. And this is not about pressuring you into that space.
I think what's, nice and beautiful or whatever about Theater Mind is it is infinitely flexible for the DM, GM. If a scenario comes up, you walk into a bar or whatever, if something's not scripted or anything, you can just roll with it. Or bringing in dungeon tiles. It's fixed. Like if you pre-made a map before, but say your scenario didn't happen in that exact spot, what are you going to do?
Right.
You got to change it. Where Theater of the Mind, you can just pick it up right there, wherever it is.
Well, and that's the cool thing about Theater of the Mind is there's a needed, required flexibility that exists inside of that space where when we start to introduce concrete things to that, we challenge that flexibility and things start to become stodgy. So rules, for example, right? You know, one of the things that I was reading in this really fantastic blog, there's a website called the DM Lair. And on the DM Lair, this guy named Luke Hart writes an article called 10 Tips for Using Theater of the Mind in D&D. And so here's an area, Garret, where with what you're saying, the notion of physical distances like feet become a real problem, because that is a specific, inflexible thing that gets in the way of theater of the mind. It's like, oh, you know, you're 35 feet away, your movement's only 30. Once you move the 30 feet in your movement, you're still going to be within 5 feet, which is technically melee. It's like, oh my God, you're going to go through all these metrics. You completely spoil the story.
Well, it's a crunchy rule.
Yeah.
Like I'm watching a movie and I can't wait for in this fight scene for them to pull out rulers before they start hitting each other.
Exactly.
Love that. Can't wait for that.
But I think Luke Hart's article is actually really quite good, and I'll probably comment on a few times while we're talking about this, because specifically specific distances are really problematic. So one of the suggestions that he makes in this is to sort of now go to turn by turn distances. It's like, can I reach that foe this turn so that I can engage in combat, or will it be next turn, or will it be 2 turns? This way, it's sort of like, I'm not necessarily worried about those granular specifics. It's like, I'm getting there this turn and I'm going to hit. Doesn't matter how far away I am.
I'm going to run it back a second to what Garret said. Ooh. Because I didn't think of this at all, but there's something about having that planned terrain or that planned encounter that you had to get ready and prepare for that kind of puts you in a box, right? Mm-hmm. And scripted shows like Dimension 20 and Critical Role can afford to be in that box. Let me just change it. Not scripted, but you know, they have a path. Structured, that's a better word. They can afford to do that, right? Because they have to hit certain notes in their game. But for a more casual experience that most of us play, we can't afford to be put in that box because it stifles the creativity and spontaneity of the moment.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, for sure. And this goes back to like when we're talking about the railroad versus the sandbox, right? We always talk about demonizing the DM or GM that's too railroady. But we all know that the DM or GM that has, you know, a game to play has to hit the certain story beats. And so there has to be some structure. But when that structure starts to get into the way of this, the flexibility required for theater of the mind, that's where we start to bump up against this problem, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really about tuning these dials very, very carefully. There's another thing that Luke Hart's article in the DM Lair talks about, and that is this idea, because, you know, what's going to happen if we decide to, you know, what we're really talking about here in theater of the mind and using, you know, getting away from using feet is like, well, now we don't need miniatures, right? Because miniatures are going to strip us away from that ability to use theater of the mind. Because the squares and the distances and the rulers and the templates. So if we're going to strip away this notion of miniature, how do we describe a scene in a dungeon that is effective so that theater of the mind can be maintained? And what Luke Hart talks about is using zones. So in a piece of combat, for example, you got a hallway, you got a doorway, and you got a room. And the enemy is in the room. And if you're in the hallway, you're 2 zones away from being in the room. Each zone requires a turn to get through. That's all. Very simple. So now all of a sudden you're able to sort of break your description, your eloquent description as DM or GM into parts that allows me to tell a player, you are currently in the hallway. You're gazing through the doorway into the room and you notice 3 enemy combatants inside the room. It's going to take you 2 turns to get in there. How do you proceed? Like, what's going to happen here, right? We're not getting crunchy at that point. I love that. So honestly, what we're talking about here is sort of like the elimination of the mini and the model. But I know that's going to piss some people off, including me.
Yeah.
Right?
Because nothing's better than having little, you know, plastic things in your hand. It feels so nice, you know, especially when you paint it in. Oh my God, it's beautiful. But there are benefits to having something like zones, right? Because it trusts the player to kind of like paint that picture in their head. It's like, all right, I got to deal with these enemies right in front of me. And then thematically and pacing wise, maybe next turn, like some enemies from the back now enter this front zone. And you can kind of just like lay it out like story beats in a sense.
Well, yeah, and I think the GM has really got to be responsible here and not introduce too many enemies in a given situation. It might be preferable if you're going to work this way as a GM to have more individual combat encounters with fewer enemies than fewer combat encounters with more enemies in them. It would be easier to track. Frankly, it does a good job of wearing your players down a little bit more slowly. In other words, if you feel like your party is always too OP because they get these short rests or long rests between every combat, well, have more frequent combat encounters that have fewer enemies in a theater of the mind style. You're probably on the right track to having a more exciting game, frankly.
Yeah.
Right? I agree with you. Number one, I'm a maker. I'm a sculptor. I love 3D printing terrain and minis all day long. I love painting them. I love the Warhammer 40K community that's painting minis like absolute wizards, and the freaking things are gorgeous, for crying out loud. However, I feel like they can get in the way. I feel like they're that inflexible thing that can get in the way.
I got inspired with this crazy kind of like take right here. Can I go with it for a second?
Please do.
So back in the day when Dungeons and Dragons first started, the focus of the game was mainly a game dungeon crawl experience, right? So you needed things like minis and terrain. And as time has gone on, the focus of the game has now morphed to storytelling, which kind of prioritizes other things that weren't prioritized in the past. But what does it say about our society and our game that in this world of assisting our brain and assisting our function to where we don't have to do certain things like, let's say, reading, we want things read to us now? What does it say that the majority of D&D players would rather not be assisted? They'd rather have their brains work than have it laid out in front of them and easy.
Number one, I love the optimism in that comment, right? Because I'm hoping that most D&D players do want to go unassisted into the imagination, right? Mm-hmm. But I worry that might not entirely be the case. My pessimist comes into play there and says, there's a certain piece of software out there that does everything for you that a lot of people pay a lot of money for, and it has become this sort of mainstay of playing this game, D&D Beyond, cough, cough. But, you know, that...
I thought you meant ChatGPT.
Oh, well, that too. Yeah, that too. There's a lot of things that help, and I've used them all, right? I've used ChatGPT. I have used D&D Beyond. I have used Roll20. I have used all of these things that assist, for better or for worse, in playing this game. But, you know, and I want to get into that. I think at some point in this podcast, I want to talk about, we're definitely going to get into a section after the break. We're going to get into a section on the VTT side of things. I got a hot take though. Because we're talking about, listen, I got to do this. And this is going to be devastating. I think it's going to be devastating. But we're talking about this space between theater of the mind and the world of the miniature and the terrain, both of which I love. You know, and you know what we forgot to mention before I do my hot take, we forgot to mention the reason the miniature exists in the first place is because TTRPGs, Dungeons & Dragons specifically, grew out of a history of wargaming, right? And wargaming was all about the miniature, and Warhammer 40K, as an offshoot of that, sort of championed the miniature and sort of stayed with that tradition of wargaming. Dungeons & Dragons takes a different exit ramp off the highway and basically says, let's grow in a direction of narrative and storytelling. Maybe we'll use minis, maybe we won't, right? So we're talking about this space between the storytelling immersion, theater of the mind, the use of the miniature, and how it functions in that space. Does it get in the way? Does it detract from the immersion? I got a hot take in there because there's a space in between that drives me freaking bananas, all right? And it's gridded dry erase maps. The white kind you get in the tube for Amazon for $8 that never sit flat on the table. The markers are always half running out. There's always like ghost images of the previous 9 games you had on there because you never clean the goddamn thing as well as you should be able to. And, you know, it becomes this visual trigger that pulls you out of the immersion, number one, right? But it doesn't do it in a way that's visually interesting. right? We're basically drawing loose caverns so that we can sort of look at the grid and see where someone is. And I'm going to say, if Theater of the Mind is the pure, imaginative, genuine experience that champions storytelling, and then on the other side, you got good minis and terrain that are beautifully painted, and they're deeply rooted in their connection to wargaming, and they titillate the maker culture and the sculptor and the miniaturist in me. Like, it lights up that mentality, and I'm like, yeah, I love that. Then I'm going to say that the gridded map is sort of like that liminal space that functions like the bad McDonald's Happy Meal toy. It's a fucking cop-out, it's a disappointment, and it makes me really sad. It's like, God, could you be any cheaper in this experience? Just don't play the goddamn game, for crying out loud.
I wish you would tell me how you really feel.
It bothers me. It's like if someone whips out that map at my table, I feel like I'm eating a stale saltine.
And the only thing it serves is measurements.
It's all it serves, exactly. It goes completely to the inflexibility of the measurement and that space where it's like, okay, don't be imaginative anymore. Yeah. Let's get gritty.
Does it aid fun? Is anybody like, oh my God, yes, he's got the grid.
Yes,
he's got the grid. Let's lock in.
I know exactly that. It's like, I can't take it.
Yeah,
I can't take it.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's not a hot take at all. And I think a lot of people are going to agree with you.
All right, challenge round for all of our listeners. I want you to go find that dry erase map that you've got and put it on the free pile in front of your house. You're done with this. You're either going all the way over to you're either going all the way over to, I was going to say TOTM, or I say Theater of the Mind, all these acronyms. Or you're going to carefully get yourself a slow, I know that a lot of people can't just go out and buy a lot of minis, right? But I feel like that space is dead. That space is an excuse. If you can't afford minis and you can't afford to buy terrain, I hear you, I feel you, I get it. Go into the Theater of the Mind space then. Dig in there. And while you're at it, can I go one more hot take, please? You guys are hating on me right now, but I'm going to do it.
Before you lock in, let me say something.
Say it, please.
I challenge the viewers to dispose of, by fire, their grids, right? Take a video of it and send it to us, and we'll make a video reacting to it.
Plastic grids on fire are bad for the environment, so I'm not going to fully support Rich's suggestion. However, if any of our viewers do send us a video of them disposing of their grids in whatever way they find necessary, we're gonna make YouTube shorts out of that. That's freaking brilliant. Here's my other momentary, in the spirit of embracing Theater of the Mind, in the spirit of playing this game in a more pure and connected and imaginative way. And then this is going to lead us right into our break, okay? Because we're going to come back from the break and talk about the opposite side of this. I want to play in a world that goes back to books, papers, and pencils, and sort of leaves behind this dependency on Wizards of the Coast's constant flim-flam about D&D Beyond and what you get and what you don't get and what you have now versus what you're going to have in 6 months. And oh my God, can we play in 6 months, or are we going to have to bust out our credit cards? We're going to go to a break. We'll see you in a few minutes. Hey, esteemed listeners. Listen, if you like what we're up to today and you like the content that we produce here at Wither and Bloom Studios and what we talk about on iCast Guidance, today's request is going to be a little bit different. Sometimes I'm trying to get you to subscribe. Sometimes I'm trying to get you to go over to Patreon and support us. Today, I think I'm going to just ask you to share the word. Tell people that we're out there. Tell people that this podcast exists. Tell people that Wither and Bloom Studios are putting together a good thing. I see comments on our channel all the time that we're underrated, and we really want to grow. We want to talk to more people. We love getting into a bigger community, and I feel like you all can help us do that. So do me a favor this week. Tell a friend we're out there. See if you can get someone to listen. It'd be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get back to the show. All right, we're back from the break, and I kind of left by lighting the room on fire with some comments about, D&D Beyond. And Rich, you were like, I got to hit that.
Bring us back. Bring us back to the paper and pen and pencil, because it is only getting worse on D&D Beyond. I remember the glory days of a year ago when you could buy a class by itself. Oh no, now I have to buy the entire book. to play as a class that I want to play or a race. Awesome. Can't wait for it to get worse. Isn't it sick to know that we could just come in here, put a book down, and say, guys, I've unlocked this class for all of you. That's crazy.
And, and I got to tell you, you're spot on with this. Ever since our dependency, and look, I want to sort of play I want to play devil's advocate here and say, look, D&D Beyond in the world of Dungeons and Dragons does provide a really good service. Okay, it does. It organizes that character sheet like gold. And if you are infinitely wealthy and you've got access to all the books, you got a lot at your fingertips. Of course, I think all of us struggle every time we sit down with, whether or not we've got this attribute or that. And the a la carte menu that they used to have was one of the best features of that thing. But this leads us into this whole space of, virtual tabletop, because D&D Beyond does play a big role in a lot of the systems that we employ over Discord and Roll20 and Foundry VTT and all these other ones. So let's talk a little bit about those spaces and how, if anything's going to, in my opinion, if anything's going to detract from theater of the mind, it's this. But Garret, you had some thoughts on this. So
I know this segment's probably going to look a little, rough on our opinions on virtual tabletop, but I want to preface this that it has its uses. I mean, we had a comment on one of our podcasts or one of our videos talking about how a user without the virtual space, they wouldn't be able to play this game. And, I think that needs to be, said. And it helped us through, the pandemic.
Oh, God, yeah.
We were able to play for a couple years. I mean, so it definitely has its usages.
Yeah, and listen, and I want to back that up. Yeah. I want to back that right up with the fact that we are coming from a place of privilege. We've got this beautiful space that we play in. We've got a dedicated group of people that's able to get here, and they want to play the game. And so we are able to sit down every week and play together live and in person. Not everybody's ability right now. I get it. And I'm both thankful, and I also don't want to come across as being like, an asshole, because I'm about to maybe say some things about where my problems are with the virtual tabletop world, right? But yeah. I digress.
I will say there was no reality in which I was ever excited for a online game as excited I was for an in-person game.
Oh, yeah. There's no comparison. I mean, if we're talking about a VTT or virtual tabletop or Roll20 or any of these, you're playing a video game, essentially.
Oof. You know what? I'm going to agree with you. It's like the technological side of me. I get excited about tech, right? And when we first got into the pandemic, and I'm like, oh my God, look at all these things we can do online with D&D. So I get on Roll20. I struggle through their infinitely non-intuitive and clunkily made UX that was like a nightmare to get through. But once I got through it, I figured it out. And then I'm like, oh my God, look at this fog of war lighting that I can employ on these maps. And it's like my players. And then what do I do? I watch my players carefully interacting with all these different things I've made. And they're playing a video game. They're walking around corners. They're like looking at stuff. And even worse, I ran a camp. I ran a Dungeons & Dragons camp in the pandemic for kids. And of course, I utilized Fog of War lighting. I utilized Roll20. I utilized, these different virtual tabletop systems. You want to see 5 kids able to move tokens around in a Fog of War map and be like, oh my God, look what's over here. Look what's over here. Look at that. It was a disaster.
Also, like, I'm gonna talk about it from my perspective. I was so afraid to role play online because I didn't know who was going to hear me, who was going to cut out, who was going to talk over themselves. It's so hard to do online.
Well, we had the gamut of players in our game that ranged from the completely technologically inept, and there was always an hour of messing around with someone's ability to patch in or, get connection. Or then, of course, in Discord, the mic cuts out for whatever reason because it switched the audio source. Oh my God, endless stuff. But let's say you're really good at it. Let's say you figured out all that stuff. What do we still have? And Garret, you said you're playing a video game.
Yeah, if you're using one of those, the only thing that's missing is the controller, essentially. But I mean, there are, like, bringing it back, we said there are people that can't get together or have the ability to sit at a table together. And, I think still being able to have that space online maybe take away from the map. try and just use just a, you know, video or audio program like Discord or something like that. And try to keep it all theater of the mind.
Well, I got a thought about that. And that's this. You know, because look, but let's go back to theater of the mind for a minute. Let's go back to the requirements that theater of the mind sort of demands of all of us. Okay. And we talk about immersion. We talk about immersion into our characters, immersion into the story. When you're watching a movie, all right, when you're watching a movie and you've got a screen in front of you, whether you're in the movie theater or you're sitting in front of your flat screen at home and you're watching something, you are in that space. The rectangle of image disappears and you go into that space, okay? And then a moth lands on the screen and it immediately creates, it breaks that connection that you have to the space. It reveals the membrane between you and that imaginative space. And you're like, fuck, I gotta kill that moth, right? Because it's not allowing you into the space. And I feel like that's entirely what virtual tabletop is it is the moth between us and the imagination, because I can't stop looking at all the distractions. I got notifications coming in on the screen. I've got icons at the bottom of my screen. I've got a mouse in my hand. I'm probably on the side playing Baldur's Gate because I don't go enough in combat, or I've got my phone out and I'm playing what's that fucking Star Wars game that you know, half of our players were playing.
Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes?
Yeah, Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes. Yeah. Like half of my players were playing Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes and not even present. I had one player in my game that consistently always attacked the foe that was already dead 3 turns earlier because they just were checked the fuck out.
Or if you're Garret, you were asleep and snoring loudly on their microphone. Yeah, I went there.
Yeah, thanks, Rich.
Never gonna live that down.
Nope, I will never live that down.
And we let you sleep.
Thank you.
It was kind of funny because you're pretty vocal in a game for the most part, and when you go silent for too long, we know.
Yeah,
we know.
Did you enjoy the, you know, sweet?
I mean, I love the sound of
my snores.
A sleeping grizzly bear. You know, I put that on when I go to bed. But let me just touch on this for a second. Kill that moth with fire. Kill it with fire, because I can't stand it. I'm going to get up and punch a hole through my TV before I let that thing hang out and take me out of my immersion.
Well, that's the reason why we've moved into an in-person game.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And but I kind of like what you were touching on, because I'd rather go in a Discord call, put my microphone and headset on, and just close my eyes and play D&D. That would be so much better than playing in a VTT.
I agree.
In my opinion.
Oh my God, I totally agree. I think the Discord call, the Discord voice chat serves a great purpose for people that are working across the internet space, right? For sure. Don't get rid of the ability to play. I mean, the internet provides us with all this great stuff, but don't let it get in the way of your imagination.
Well, that's what I was trying to say before. It's just, you know, use those abilities to connect with those people.
Right.
But maybe don't bring the whole gameplay of the virtual tabletop into it.
If there's one thing, and I just thought of this now, but if there's one thing inside of all those different virtual systems that is an absolute volume 10 signifier of what is wrong with that space, it is when D&D Beyond lets you roll dice on a screen. It's like, are you kidding me? And they're like, get this new set of dice. I'm like, that's not a set of dice. I'm like, a set of dice clacks in my hand and I'm like, come on, I'm not that old fashioned, okay? I'm not a Luddite. I am not some old fashioned guy who's like, we can only play with paper and pencil. No, I engage with all of those things and I love those things, but you are not going to get me to enjoy a freaking digital set of dice.
No. Can I fondle them in my hand? Can I peer through the dice to see what's inside? No. I can't. I can only roll them.
I want to touch them.
Are you guys asking for my consent on this?
Never.
Oh my God.
I'm kidding. That was a joke. Please cut that out of the podcast.
No, leave that in there.
Oh my God. But I think we're frustrated. I think the whole point of this podcast, or at least where this is going right now, is with a kind of frustration over us losing our game.
Let me pose a question to you, gentlemen. Is bad D&D better than no D&D?
I would say yes, just because I want to play something. But we've experienced great D&D in what we're doing now in our space that we have now. And I've experienced okay D&D for our quarantine time, but I still enjoyed it.
Well, I'm going to go with the opposite of that. I'm going to say that look, when I do something, I am the type of person, especially as a maker, as an artist and somebody who teaches, if I'm going to do something, I want to do it right. And not doing it right to me is so frustrating that I'd rather not do it at all. So to me, bad D&D is, I'm not going to say a waste of time, but I don't think it's better than no D&D. I'm going to take the no D&D time space and I'm going to do something else with that, and I'm going to do that right rather than muck about. Because, okay, so let's ask ourselves, well, why are we having a bad time of it? What's going wrong? Are we using the wrong systems? Do we have the wrong players at the table? You know, are we drunk? Did we not have anything to eat beforehand, so we're all hangry? Like, why is it going bad? And I'm going to be like, all right, you all got to fix this because I'm out if we don't, right?
Yeah. And I think that also stands, but I think the worst case where I'm like, okay, you can have bad D&D is when someone is coming to the table for the first time or playing D&D for the first time. If I were to introduce someone to D&D through the virtual space, I would not expect them to want to play again.
Well, they do. They do want to play again. I had a lot of people that I introduced to that space through virtual space, and they did absolutely have a great time of it and were disappointed when the game fell apart. I would say that when you bring a new player to the table with the topic we're talking about today, is setting expectations about how theater of the mind is going to work, like how we're going to delve into the way in which we imagine the story going through, the way we sort of dig into those immersive spaces. That's what you got to explain to the new player. That's what you got to tell them about, so that when they leave, if they at least spend a little bit of time doing that, whether it's virtual or in person, they're going to have a better experience. They're going to have a better game. So I'm for all of these systems. At the end of this podcast, I think I'm for all of these systems, but I'm for setting the right expectations for how they will be employed so that you can have the deepest possible experience.
I totally second that.
I agree on that. Yeah.
And we're all going to have our different preferences on the type of game that we want to play and run.
Right. And so in that, what have we said today? Well, we've said that we're going to do a few things. Number one, we're probably going to be a lot more flexible in the way we allow the story to unfold and maybe give up a little of the control in some of the crunchier mechanics, a la Daggerheart, because that's one of that. Look, for those of you that have been listening to us, you know that we're loving on this game big time, and we're actually doing some work in that whole game, and we'll get to that later. But that's that's not for now. But two, what else are we going to do? Well, we're going to get rid of our dry erase maps, and you're going to send us videos of you getting rid of your dry erase maps so that we can have fun with that.
And we're going to start a movement.
Yeah. We're going to start a movement. I like that. We're going back to books, paper. Look, I'm going to put it out there. All right. If you have any beef with what's been going on in the D&D space around D&D Beyond and Wizards of the Coast, the weak link in this chain, is your dependency on digital. All you got to do is, if you got the books, papers, and pens, they're screwed. Because all the dependency on all that income stream that they've decided they're going to depend on, it's gone. You guys can all sit around the table. You can play this game. You can enjoy it. You can share your books. You can put them in a pile in the middle of the table and 6 people can grab them. Mm-hmm. Can't really do that unless you spend a ton of money with D&D Beyond. I mean, you can to some degree. I know I can share my content with my players. I get it, blah, blah, blah. But you can do it with the 6 players that are here. And then they can take those books home and read them. And they can do it again and again and again.
Yeah.
Right?
And the unlimited support for third party. If you find this really cool, awesome, tried and play tested book of new races and classes, and you bring it to the table and you're like, hey guys, you guys can play these, try them out.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can do that.
This is why the game became such a phenomenon in its early days, is because it didn't rely on all the copyright and digital sort of space. So, So that's what we're making the movement towards. We're going back to that.
Yeah.
All right. And buy some real dice.
Buy some real dice. God damn it.
You guys, this has been a great conversation today. I love it. I'm really thankful to the two of you for having it with me and just kind of getting a chance to talk this stuff out. We got some good stuff coming up, right?
Hell yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So we are going to, for now, we're going to say goodbye. Listen, please go over to Wither and Bloom Studios. I want you to, number one, can you subscribe to that channel? And number two, leave some comments on this video down below. Let us know what you think. We'll bring it up in the chat. Hopefully we didn't sort of set you guys on fire and infuriate you too much with our heated commentary today, but we got some passion here.
And if we did set you on fire, let us know, because maybe in a future podcast we could talk about it.
I agree. I agree. All right, so let us know how you're feeling out there, people, and we will see you next week with another podcast. Take care. Thanks for listening.
Adios.
See ya.
All right, everybody. iCast Guidance is produced by Todd Lambrix and Garret Brennan. Head over to YouTube, where we can be found at Wither and Bloom Studios, where you can see the production of this podcast every Sunday morning live at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're looking forward to seeing you there. Take care.